welcome and thank you.
Thank you for those introductory remarks. Just one point, the real founder of evolutionary psychology was John Tooby and his wife, Leda Cosmides. John passed away about 2 weeks ago at the age of 71, unfortunately. So,
sorry to hear that.
Well, however, we won't get to evolutionary psychology for a little while because first we have to get to generation ships. This is a work in progress. It should have been finished a year ago, but then I was, unfortunately, had problems with illness. And I hope I have a chance to finish this with my collaborators. Okay, what is a generation ship? Well, it's a spaceship, an interstellar vessel, and it takes generations to travel from one star to another. Sounds pretty simple. And my main point is, social problems can destroy a ship just as thoroughly as engineering problems can. And that'll be expanded discussion a little later. I do have to deal with some technical issues, but I am by no means a techie. And I'm not a physicist, I'm not an engineer, etc. So I'm relying on other people for some of the technical stuff. Okay, of course, I'm also relying on science fiction. And while I don't write it, I've been reading it all my life. And as a matter of fact, the original thinkers and the people who have probably thought most about generation ships are science fiction writers and makers of films. If you saw the Expanse, that was a generation ship they were talking about. But here I'm going to exclude most of the science fiction, simply because generation ships, to me, are something that we're going to be seeing and they're going to be real. And, well, science fiction, the idea is to entertain, not necessarily to make ideas progress. For instance, an awful lot of the science fiction, the generation ships have suspended animation. Wait a second. They're not generation ships if they're suspended animation, right? But I'm excluding things that at the moment seem to be really quite impossible. So there is no suspended animation research in progress that I've heard of that looks like it's ever going to lead to suspended animation. Used to be thought, well, what we need are corpuscles. We'll just go freeze. This problem of cell walls being destroyed by ice crystals when you freeze them, and whether you freeze the person dead or alive. If they weren't alive, if they weren't already dead, they are inevitable, irrevocably. So, no. There's been recent research on hibernation, trying to understand hibernation in bears and other mammals to see if it can be applied to human beings. Maybe, but that's not going to help you much with the generation ship. Bears hibernate very briefly. They use up an enormous amount of calories. It's neat research. It's not going to help you if what you want to do is go to another star. So, as with faster than light travel, suspended animation and hibernation and so on, both appear, at least at present, to be impossible. Science fiction is a great source, though, for ideas and entertainment. But in terms of planning actual generation ships, it is strictly limited. Nevertheless, I expect generation ships to start being under construction within 10 years. Well, anybody currently building one? Nobody in this group, huh? Okay. I don't know of anybody who's building one yet. Not yet, but here we go. These are just my notes over here that I keep on holding and looking at. Now, there are a couple of articles in Scientific American by the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, and he says, generation ships probably won't be built, and if they are built, we should be waiting until there's sustained civilization on our own planet, and let's go solve our problems before we build generation ships. Mostly they're not going to be built. And I think he was wrong. I think they're going to be built and built much sooner than we expect. Why? Well, how about competition? What kind of competition? Well, obviously, competition among nation states that fueled and still fuels much space age technology. You think if the Americans hadn't gone to the moon, the Chinese would now be not be on the moon now. But there's competition among billionaires, say Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. First, they were competing for who would get to the moon first, and now they're competing for ships capable of going to Mars. The last I heard, NASA had awarded a large large contract rather, to Jeff Bezos. So at the moment, he seems to be leading over there. Why else, though, would there be competition? Well, various groups are likely to find the idea of having a planet of their own irresistible. I mean, I wouldn't mind one myself, actually. Not just billionaires. How about religious groups, cults? I really don't want to point out particular groups because perhaps they might find it insulting, but there are certainly religions that would not be surprising to find them trying to send their missionaries, their people, off to a new planet. Then again, any group that considers itself to be oppressed and wants to flee, if they can find the resources, a generation ship might very well be interesting to them. And there are visionary leaders who see this as the next step for human progress. Might even be internet influencers with sufficient following to finance creation of a generation ship and recruit crew and passengers. But another reason why I think we're going to be seeing generation ships is that the research to develop them is already well in progress. Thanks to serendipity, the people doing the research probably aren't thinking about generation ships, but that doesn't matter. They're still doing the research. There's artificial biosphere research. How do you create an ecology that's going to maintain a steady state of oxygen? Well, there have been a number of experiments along these lines already. And you need to know how to do that if you want a generation ship to work. You're going to have to eat and have food for generations. There's hydroponic research, food production. Vertical agriculture is another technique that's being used. Tissue culture meat production. Artificial meat, too, is now very common. And just the other day, I came across an article on using artificial Martian regolith, as close as we can get now to soil samples, using, I forget which species of insects now, and human waste. And they discovered that, well, about a 10% mix of the regolith if the regolith is mixed with just 10% of the insect-treated human waste, you can grow things on it. And since one of the sources of material is likely to be from the asteroids on the ships, you can certainly grind that down into something like Martian regolith. And so research on food production, in other words, is already well underway. And then how about nuclear rockets? There was about a year ago, I think, a NASA DARPA announcement of optimistic plans to build a nuclear rocket capable of reaching Mars by 2027. Now, it'll never happen. It'll take much longer than that, of course. But if you've got nuclear rockets, now you're already working on power and propulsion for generation ships. There's also a lot of work being done on, on fission, nuclear fission, and that would be a great power source. However, fission is something that is always 10 years away, right? I remember 20 years ago, it was 10 years away. So I'm not too optimistic about that. But what they are building now is small nuclear reactors rather than the giant ones. And you might need 2 or 3, but it means that work on power sources for generation ships is, again, well underway. And then mining, asteroid mining. There are half a dozen companies busy getting their plans and assembling their money to do asteroid mining. And there's a lot of research being done on targeting particular asteroids and bringing back tiny samples from them to see what they're in. Later on, they'll be doing that kind of work in the asteroid belt. And eventually they'll be doing that work on comets. Again, as we'll see, asteroids may be really crucial in designing generation ships. Okay. Oh, yes. Can you convert an asteroid into a generation ship? It depends what it's made out of. And I'm just reading some discussions in a physics review on this. If they're just sort of loose gravel, then no, you can't. But they might be very hard. They might be full of metal. They might be, part of the core of an exploded planet. Hollow them out. Give them, what am I looking for? Rotate them rapidly enough so that if you're on the inside, if you're upside down as far as the outside is concerned, you get 1 degree of gravity. That is, you get the kind of gravity you would get standing on the Earth. You might tunnel them, you might have various layers, or you might melt them and explode them with volatiles, even just water, to create a nice sphere. There are all sorts of things that people are talking about doing. I think, again, leading up to generation ships, there's the potential for movement of much industrial activity, especially smelting and other heavy industry, to space. Asteroids are potentially almost limitless sources of materials. And with 3D printing or related techniques, we may be doing an awful lot of our manufacturing in space or on the moon. Then again, another reason why I have faith is, yes, there is going to be a generation ship being built. Where do you aim it? Where do you send it? Oh, to a planet that might have life on it, or at least might be a place where human beings could live. Well, we have, we'll say, the James Webb Space Telescope and an awful lot of other space telescopes that, among other things, are telling us where there are planets in the golden zone, the warm spots where water can be liquid. And that's sort of the minimum of what you want. And we're rapidly getting to the point we'll be able to know something about the atmospheres of these planets. So the technical problems for generation ships are well on their way to being solved. Great. And of course, the social problems are being ignored. And that's where we're going to get evolutionary psychology. But we can just refer to it as history right now. All human societies have history. A generation ship, let's say we've solved the technical problems, we're on our way. Maybe for a couple of centuries. We're not going to be able to go very fast, maybe 10% the speed of light, but probably a lot slower than that. And even the best planning, most comprehensive planning at the outset, may fail as the social structure and culture of the ship changes. That is, as the ship develops its own history. I wish that there were such a person as Harry Seldon, For those who've read science fiction or read it, the Selden Psychohistory of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. That's the mathematical discipline that can, in effect, predict history with varying success. Otherwise, he wouldn't have much of a plot in there, but still. That's pure science fiction. Sorry, I'm a certified social scientist, and, we don't have anything like that. I don't think anybody's even trying to do that. But we can't rely on evolutionary psychology that underlies human psychology, and also sociology and anthropology, ultimately.
Gary, may I ask a question?
Of course.
So in terms of where to aim the generation ship, so let's say aiming it to a planetary system surrounding one of the nearby stars, talking about, say, maybe 10 or 20 light years away, given that the closest star to us is about 4 light years away. Maybe that doesn't have the right kind of planetary system, but perhaps 15 light years away, there is a star that has the right kinds of planets. The amount of time that it would take us to get there. So you touched upon this briefly as to what is the speed at which the ship is traveling. If we were to go by the speed that, say, the Voyager spacecraft is traveling, so Voyager has taken 50 years to get to 1 light day away from us. If we are talking about 10 light years, then we are talking about like 100,000 years to get to that place, which is, in terms of generations, it's more generations than have elapsed between the Neanderthals and us, like 10 times as many generations. So is that the kind of, am I in the right ballpark in terms of the numbers that you have in mind?
Well, I hope not. Voyager, fine, you have a propellant that you've managed to get out of the Earth's gravity well, and you aim it. And after that, you have very limited ways of further aiming it because you've just used up most of your fuel, most of your ability to go, and you're not going very fast given the distances involved. The idea of a generation ship is it's going to be big. Estimates I've seen range from 500 to 1,000 people. It might be a huge hollowed out asteroid, or it might just be made of metals mined from asteroids, but it's going to be enormous. It's going to have nuclear plants and maybe fission plants, and it's going to keep on propelling itself, going faster and faster for a very long time. So, no, it will take, who knows, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, but probably not more than that. So long as
it's a significant fraction of the speed of light that you expect the ship to be traveling at.
Well, as I say, 10% the speed of light strikes me and strikes other commentators as a reasonable goal to aim at. And even that would be pretty fantastic to do. Okay.
Curve this space.
Anyway, let's see, though, in terms of evolutionary psychology, why I'm saying that would be problemless. Okay, well, suppose we use a military model. That's pretty much common. All of the crewed spaceships that we've sent up so far, there's a captain, there are officers, and if it's large enough, there's a crew, though I don't think we're big enough yet to have crews. But a generation ship would have these things. Oh, and of course, aside from the captain and crew, there are going to be people with various specialties who do the grunt work involved in producing food, maintaining the nuclear generator, if that's the power source, making sure the ship's engines are working, recycling old materials, constant safety inspections, all parts of the ship, obviously, and probably reproducing the ship, rebuilding the ship piece by piece, because we don't build anything that we can count on that's going to last a couple of 100 years. Okay, well, that sounds fine. I mean, somebody's got to be doing the cleaning, the manufacturing of clothing, and so on. But from the point of view of how we evolved, we human beings have evolved to ordinarily want more for our own kin, and especially our children, than we want for the children of others. This sometimes strikes liberals, oh, not me, as I send my child to an expensive private school. We are nepotistic, and that is part of the nature of the species. I remember back in 1968, doing field work in northern Nigeria, and a house of peasant farmer approached me, and I didn't actually know him, but he and a small group of people around him asked me, would I really give a job to someone who did well in a civil service exam rather than to my brother? Now, brother in this context means somebody with whom to have a personal connection, maybe a relative, maybe from the same town, etc. But would I really do that? And I looked at him, said, yes, of course I would. And he sort of, well, he and the other men exchanged glances. And I realized that I just confirmed their belief that I was quite mad. This made absolutely no sense to them. Yes, what we consider nepotism, and it's a bad thing, is about as human as sibling rivalry, about as human as sexual jealousy. And it's easy to see that nepotistic people, I mean, evolution is about getting more of your genes in the gene pool than the next person over. And so if you favor people with whom you share genes or have a high probability of sharing genes, those genes are going to increase in the gene pool. The traits reflected in those genes, in this case nepotism, will become traits of the species. So of course we're nepotistic. We have moral codes because we're saying nepotism is bad. We need them because we're nepotistic. And fighting nepotism may, in many cases, give a state, a collectivity, a real advantage. But for us as individuals, no, not really. We want to stop other people from being nepotistic. But if I'm a doctor, I still want to send my kids to medical school. Okay, so what does this mean for a generation shift? Oh, well, the first generation, remember, had a captain and officers and a crew and grunts. And you know what they're going to do with their children? Well, the captain and the officers are going to do their very best to make sure that their children also are at the least officers. And the ordinary crew and the grunts are going to try to make sure that their kids rise, but they're going to have a lot of trouble rising because the advantage, the power, is in the hands of those who are already there, and they're busy favoring their own children. This is likely to breed resentment. I should be captain, or at least, an officer. I'm brighter than those officers, but I didn't get a chance to go to the schools or get the extra training or just have people put in a good word for me that the ones who outpaced me did. I'm angry about it. And eventually you're likely to have an insurrection. Space is a pretty unforgiving environment. Okay, I was just reading, you probably can fire a bullet safely because if you have enough shielding to protect yourself against meteorites, a bullet probably can't go through, but it's awfully easy to destroy your food supply, or sabotage, or simply ignore problems with your power source. How many generations will it be before the ship is destroyed by internal conflict? 2? 3? that it's going to last 100 years? I don't think so, no. Human beings desire prestige and position for themselves too, not just for their children. And rivalries can undermine ship solidarity and cooperation. Would-be leaders are always available from the ranks of those dissatisfied with their current social status. Okay, here's another problem from evolutionary psychology, one less obvious, unless you're already familiar with the Westermarck hypothesis, which I've always liked to frame as familiarity does not breed. There is some controversy over the hypothesis, but it does appear that if you raise children as siblings, when it comes time for permanent attachments, they're less likely to find one another attractive than they are to find strangers attractive. And, the original stuff from this came from the Israeli kibbutzim, and where kibbutzniks tended to marry outside their own kibbutz. Well, you can solve this problem. I mean, you could have two ships and you marry into the other ship, or you can simply separate the ship into segments and tribes and make sure that your different groups are not treated as siblings, or rather that there are a number of different sibling-like groups. But there are so many other evolved psychological traits that we have to deal with if we expect a generation ship to last more than a generation or two. Gossip. Bad, right? Universal, right? Why is it universal? Well, what do I do with gossip? I collect valuable information, or potentially valuable information, that may help me improve my status. I put into the gossip stream, into the information stream, ideas that undermine my rivals. Gossip. You could have written a paper on gossip. But there's a lot of research in evolutionary psychology on gossip because it's everywhere. Let's see now. Sexual jealousy. Yep, you find that everywhere. A lot of the efforts to control the sexuality of women that we see in many groups and in our own history really has to do with sexual jealousy. Other people will have sexual access to our women, or the women to our men. Is that going to really do bad things for your solidarity and the operation of your generation ship? Yep, not going to help anyway. Sibling rivalry. That's everywhere. Some societies encourage it. The Yanomami, Brazil. On the other hand, some societies, such as our own, work hard against it. The interesting thing about these human traits is that we keep on thinking that we can solve these problems. Well, we can, but only for one generation. Every generation has to deal with it. Every generation, parents have to work to minimize sibling rivalry. Having only one child is the best way to do it, but there are other fairly effective ways to do it. But if we don't deal with this with every generation on the sibling and on our generation shift, we're going to have, Lord, one sibling has followers and the other sibling has followers on the followers now. And suddenly we've got political parties hating one another. We have people sabotaging one another. It's pretty messy. Sorry, was someone saying something there?
No, we were just laughing.
Okay. Yeah. The failure of our cultural editing mechanisms, which are failing right now to horrendous effect. One of our chief cultural editing mechanisms is that we pay preferential attention to the high high in status, and therefore learn from them preferentially. And this is an idea, though he never gets credited with it, but it's an idea from the late Michael Chance. But this is, okay, we evolved in small bands, small groups. Now, who had status? Who had prestige? Who did we pay special attention to? Well, remember once when I was working in Nigeria's Middle Belt, somebody pointing out a woman to me and says she has 10 children and they've all survived. Wow. Yeah. And the same man pointed to somebody who making yam mounds. You plant yams in hills, and this was very much a yam growing community. And I forget how many he managed to make in one day, but it was some incredible number. Okay, these are people that were admired, that you learned preferentially from. But what happens in the West and probably in that society nowadays? Well, do you even know what your neighbor does? Who is it who has the status? A professional entertainer? A professional athlete? Someone very wealthy, regardless of how that wealth was obtained. So you want to be like them. Do you know how to get to be like them? Is it really particularly good for your society if you're going to be like them? And in the world over, all you have to say to a parent of at least teenage kids, is kids nowadays, and you'll hear the story about, I don't understand what these kids are doing. They want to be like this. They want to be like that. They don't want to be like me. This is a reasonably successful parent, or their neighbor, or their Aunt Rita. And now we're on a generation ship. Oh, I left out influencers. You want to be like people on the internet who have learned to become expert in presenting themselves as important people because of the way they're dressed, the confidence with which they present themselves, their sense of humor, and their ability to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of the status of their rivals. Okay, but now we're on the generation ship, and we're getting all these problems, especially the influencers and the people who manage to persuade others that they're really high status, prestigious, important people, and you should learn from them. Only maybe, as in the science fiction stories, what they're teaching is planet Earth, that's a myth, never existed. We're going to another planet, that's nonsense. This is home. This is where we will always be. And you get enough followers, hey, maybe there's a new captain. We're seeing this kind of thing happening in our politics right now here on Earth. But in a generation ship with limited sources of information, and perhaps some people will block or destroy information, well, the ship may never reach its destination and will probably cease to function after a generation or so. Feeling pessimistic now about generation ships? Well,
when is the doomsday?
what do we do now? Well, how about some research? There are some human societies that seem to persist for quite a while. Anybody ever hear of the Zulu? Yeah, sort of speak the language. Are there groups of Zulu or communities of Zulu who are resistant to change, who are continuing to be what they are and what they have been, or who identify core values and work hard to make sure that their children learn them? Well, this is the kind of research we need. One of the kinds of research. We need to look the world over, the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch, who seem to be resistant to, mostly resistant. What do they do that's right? I'll give you a hypothesis. If we pay preferential attention to the high in status, they convince their children that they are high in status. I once saw a society in the opposite, do exactly the opposite, where it was an age grade society, which means as if you had, call it 3 ranks, and I'll only talk about the men because talking about the women gets to be more complicated here. And the age grade higher than yours would select from the lower one each year people to be promoted into it. The middle age grade was the one that did the physical labor. They did military defense, and especially, this is again the yam culture, they made the mounds for yams for everybody. For the women, well, there were no poor because everybody had land, and the hard work of planting them was done by the men at the peak of their ability. Only some of these men joined the Nigerian army. And what they learned, to their horror, is they were looked down upon, and their senior age grade, older men who wore their hair in a particular way, it turned out everybody else in the region thought that was the way women should wear their hair, and they laughed at them. And they would color themselves with a purple dye. And that was considered really dirty and horrible. And so these middle age grade men learned that their revered elders were in fact not treated with contempt, considered with contempt by many of the surrounding communities. And they came back home, they were furious. They attacked some of the elders to get them to change their ways. The elders responded with, we're not going to promote anybody into our age right now. The economic structure and the young men, the middle grade, responded by, well, we're not going to be doing any yam hills for anybody except ourselves now. And everything collapsed. Interestingly, though, since nepotism is part of being human, I did a study of correlating coefficient of relatedness to a number of hours donated to someone. And basically, people would help out their relatives with making the yam hills, and the closer the relative, the more time they would give them. So nobody went hungry, but the traditional society had indeed collapsed. Okay. But what happens if something undermines in our generationship the structure of respect? Maybe because of gossip, of misinformation, of rivalry. Then why should anybody do the lousy work of keeping things clean or producing food or making sure there's oxygen? Well, so what do we do now? Do we say, I mean, I've already said there are going to be generation shifts, and I do believe that. But I also believe that if the researchers don't get on the ball, then they're all going to be failed generation shifts. So one research strategy, as I said, so let's take a look at societies that exist, seem to be able to continue to exist. I'm not sure how you can manage to do experiments. There probably are ways, I just don't know how to do it. It would certainly have to be long-term. But if we have an interest in going to space and in visiting some of these other planets, well, colonizing them really, then we need to be doing some heavy thinking now about this problem. So I'll leave it to you guys to solve these problems. The nice thing about getting on in years is that you don't have to solve anything. You can just say, hey, I pointed out the problem. That's my share of it. So perhaps you'll be able to help them.
I have a comment. I was wondering if we could use insects that have colonies like bees and ants as kind of like a guiding star, and think of kind of like a starship as kind of like a hive, and somehow there was evolutionary pressure for bees to think more about the hive than the individual.
Well, I
Is
think
that a good way? Is that a good kind of? I guess the question is that a good direction for the research?
well, I doubt very much if a bee has any conception of what a hive is. A bee does work in particular, here is, well, this attacker, and this is the way that I respond. Here is a source of pollen. When I come home, this is how I dance to communicate to the others where it is. But some people would argue that you should think of, if any of the social insects stick to hives, think of them as single organisms, and the bees as their cells. So I don't think we could be human and keep and be like social insects. There is at least one science fiction story. I never remember any names of authors, but it was where Earth gets attacked by a hive of creatures who are not intelligent, but eventually produce an intelligence. And as it turns out, the argument is that intelligence is not a particularly productive or valuable trait, except in special circumstances, and they only produce an intelligent individual in those circumstances. And otherwise, they act bees in the hive. When they must produce an intelligent creature, they adopt the species into their own. So, meandering. So I don't think it would be useful for us to even consider that we could be anything like bees. But I could, of course, be entirely wrong.
Jerry, thank you very much. This was just exhilarating. It was just so different from the kinds of talks I have I've gotten used to hearing. This was really nice, just to think broadly. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
So let me run, just as you were describing generation ships, I was thinking about what could be an alternative to a generation ship. And I'm sure you've thought of this option, but I'm curious to hear your reaction. So instead of sending live humans on the ship, imagine that you're sending some spermatozoa and eggs, so unfertilized eggs. The ship makes its merry way for centuries until it's getting close to a planetary system. And that's when the fertilization occurs. And the technology that this requires is that for the fetus to be nurtured in an artificial womb and for it to develop without a human mother. But I can imagine that this is not completely crazy. One can create the right kinds of artificial intelligence to nurture a child from the fetal stage to a functioning human. So that would take away from the challenges of having generations after generations of humans having to make their way. Instead, it's just these long-lasting cells that come together to make a human at the right time. Is that at all a viable strategy, or are there fatal flaws there?
Well, it is something that the science fiction writers have thought about, written about. Just the other day, I was reading an article about the development of an artificial womb, an artificial uterus, not yet for human beings, but to get which a small animal. But the article concluded that if this works for one mammal, it's going to work for other mammals, including ourselves. So that part makes sense. And we could certainly, I mean, in this age of chatbots and so on, create robots that are human-like. They'd have to be soft anyway, as we know from Harlow's work way back with monkeys, so infants respond to that. And with the proper AI, it might be able to raise reasonably sane people. Of course, you'd need, I think it's 500 or 600 people in order to have enough of a genetic mix. So this would be really a large-scale operation, but it could be done. I don't know if we would call that a generation ship, but
it would just be a single generation taking form close to the destination.
Yeah. Though, of course, once you got close to your destination, you might discover you had to do a lot of terraforming, and you would now have a 500 or 1,000 years in orbit while you change the atmosphere or alter the soil, etc. But it's still a potentially viable idea. And if generation ships don't work, or we can't figure out how to work them, then if the technology permits us to make parent substitutes, surrogates rather, and to make artificial wombs that actually work, and to maintain a ship without, human presence for, it's still going to take centuries. But yeah, it might be the way to go. Of course, it gets into other problems. One of the things I like about having a large power supply and having an asteroid with lots and lots of material to use is that as you get closer to your target planet, you may discover that it's unsuitable for any huge number of reasons. And you may then look around, already know that there are other targets, and therefore change direction. And we've just added 100 years to the trip, but now we have a better chance of getting a planet we can actually use. As I say, I'm expecting you guys to solve these problems. I really don't know how to.
I guess the question would be, what's the motivation of people to send somebody there? So if somebody wants to leave, why would they do that? Or why would they would want to send themselves or their family?
Well, but in Jerry's conception of the generation ship, even if you get on the ship, you're not the one that's going to get to the
But your plan, or your group, supposedly.
But if it's your gametes, your sperm or your eggs,
would it be satisfying enough for them?
Yeah. Charlie.
Charlie's
gonna.
I have no faith in us ever making it to whatever planet we're going. I was just imagining like you were saying, we get to the planet and then we realize, oh shoot, we need to terraform this thing 100 or 200 years, and then everybody just blows up the ship.
Well, if you read Kim Stanley Robinson's articles in Scientific American, his constantly repeated point is there is no planet B. This is the only planet that we have. And we really should take a lot better care of it because we're kind of reverse terraforming it very rapidly right now. But we're not going to make it to another planet. Now, I think actually we could, but the idea that it's going to be as hospitable as Earth used to be is kind of ridiculous. Plus, of course, you can get into ethical problems. Are we preventing life from developing or continuing to evolve on that new planet? And does a species which has already destroyed one planet, the one it evolved on, deserve another chance? So you do get into ethical issues as well. I would imagine that as soon as, say, Elon Musk started to build a generation ship, that there would be worldwide protests. Mm-hmm. But of course, how you deal with that is another research problem. Or if you're Elon Musk, you just do it.
Are there any movies or science fiction stories that have tackled the topic of generation shift especially well, in your opinion, Jerry?
Well, Expanse gets good reviews. And that I got on Amazon Prime, but I get Canadian Amazon Prime, so it's not necessarily what I think you get it in the States, or did you have it in the States. After that, the problem with thinking too much about this stuff is that it ruins the pleasure in reading the stories. I mean, you know the problem, you know what they've left out and what they didn't tackle, etc. So I don't know that I could recommend any, except that there are a great many of them that are thoroughly enjoyable.
So what about likelihood? I have two questions. What about the likelihood of, I mean, if there is a hospitable planet, there are already being some organisms there to deal with. And also, if we had to choose people to go on a generation ship, do you have a metric of choosing the people?
Well, we're nepotistic, so I would, of course, choose my relatives. And that way I also get rid of my relatives, which is, so it's a win-win situation. I don't know whether there would be any good metric, except that you want to take a wide variety and as much genetic diversity as you possibly can. And, I mean, my first impulse would be, well, you want to take people with high IQs. Not necessarily. You really want people who are able to get along with other people. After that, being smart is nice, but and of course, I think you're already, I mean, the self-selection bias in there. What kind of people are willing to be confined to this vessel for the rest of their lives? And also, they're sentencing their children and probably their grandchildren to also being confined there. I mean, children might be very angry when they realize the decision has been made for them, or the grandchildren.
Jerry, I regrettably have to break off. Everybody else should, of course, carry forth. But this was wonderful. I really loved it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.